Hi, my name is Mary, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you the 29 books that I read in June of this year. Since it's Pride Month, a lot of my reading was centered around LGBT fiction and non-fiction. So what I'm going to do is first start off with the LGBT-centric fiction, move into the LGBT-centered non-fiction, and then we're going to wrap up the video with the books that I read that were not related to Pride at all. Let's get started. The first book that I want to talk about was the classic that I read this month, and that was Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. This is a novel about a young woman who finds herself falling victim to a female vampire and her sort of lesbian-coded sexual attentions. Now, as it was written in the 19th century, it actually went on to inspire one of the most famous vampire novels of all time, that is Dracula, which is also one of my favorite novels. But it also was not a novel that I had ever read before, which is surprising because I do love me some vampires. But the thing is that this tiny little novel I'd always stayed away from because of the way that it showed lesbian sexuality as something dangerous and to be avoided. However, I'm really glad that I read it this month because I do think it's important to realize the ways that lesbian attraction has been shown in books in ways that are not so flattering, but also just because it was a great and really page-turning book. I was surprised, given how archetypal the plot is, that I was able to feel like I just wanted to keep turning the pages to find out what happens next. If it's not a book that you've read, you could probably read it in a handful of hours. It's quite short. I know there's an audiobook of it on YouTube that I'll try to link down below as well, and it would definitely be something that I might recommend either for another Pride Month or for something like Halloween if you're interested in reading something that's really high on the gothic horror. Anyway, I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next section that I'm going to talk about are classics of LGBT fiction, most of them published in the 20th century, so not old classics, but definitely classics of the canon, and I want to start off by talking about Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. This is a novel about a young butch who is growing up in the pre-Stonewall era, so an era before there was such a really thing as a politically charged gay and lesbian liberation front. Now, when I talk about this novel, it's interesting to talk about the ways in which this character's identity has changed in interpretation over time. Leslie Feinberg has commented that the butch identity of this main character straddles the line between lesbian and trans identity. I guess I would call it identity politics, but in such a way that I think, rather than alienating either, really speaks to both and speaks to a shared heritage of LGBT pride. This main character goes through a lot, but knowing that this novel is semi-autobiographical really does help without feeling like the novel has become sort of torture porn in any way. Rather, it is just a novel that is heart-wrenching in its depiction of what life was like before there was a united gay front. In this way, I really do think that this novel is almost essential reading for anyone who wants to read some of the history of femme and butch relationships in the lesbian community, but also about burgeoning trans identity. This is a deeply troubling book, and there are a lot of episodes of violence within it, but I hope that will not let anybody think that this is not a novel that is worth reading. It absolutely brought me to tears, and I gave this one 5 stars. The next classic that I read in the LGBT canon I have slightly less sympathy with, that is this one, The City and the Pillar by Gore Vidal. Now, Gore Vidal is a quite famous writer who has been working not just in the gay canon, but also in speculative fiction and in literary criticism. He had quite a sharp and interesting wit about him, and so I was excited to pick up this book. I had been thinking of reading some of his historical fiction, but thought for Pride I would start off with this book, which is one of his early novels and is about a young man who develops an obsession with his best friend who he shared a one-night gay tryst with. His friend has gone on to be, for all intents and purposes, heterosexual and has moved on and is going off into the Merchant Marines. But our character that we follow struggles with setting a boundary and with idealizing this man in his head. No other relationship that he has seems to live up to his expectations. Unfortunately, the thing that I struggled with in this is that Gore Vidal is very intent on setting up his characters as all American white masculine boys. And a lot of emphasis is placed on the fact that they are not fairies or queens or effeminate in any regard. And in doing so, he comes across as someone who has a lot of ingrained homophobia within him. It really does strike me as a little bit unfortunate how unresponsive he is to the idea that maybe he should take other gay people seriously, or that he should take any women seriously, because Gore Vidal has a hefty dose of misogyny in here, which to me is coming across as quite unfortunately commonplace in gay literature. But this one, really the worst thing about it is the ending. I will not spoil it for you, but it is graphic and unflattering to the gay community as a whole, and I hated this book from top to tail. I gave this one 2 stars. Another work that I read this month is called Carol, or originally published as The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. Carol is a novel about a young woman named Therese who has fallen in love with an older woman named Carol. Carol is a woman who is already quite comfortable in having relationships with other women, despite the fact that she was married to a man. And so Therese is not only falling in love with Carol, but discovering her attractions to other women at the same time. Now, this was adapted into a movie just a couple of years ago, starring Cate Blanchett as Carol, and it's quite a faithful adaptation. So if you really loved the movie but haven't yet read Carol the book, or The Price of Salt, as it's also called, then I would probably recommend it because it's quite faithful in the adaptation. However, the thing is that for me, the novel, which takes place via Therese's point of view and has a lot of her kind of stream of consciousness and a lot of her perspective within it, does struggle in some regards, because unfortunately it seems to me that Therese's relationship with Carol is almost inherently unequal and almost inherently unhealthy. There are a lot of times when her perspective of her relationship with Carol does not seem to line up with Carol's perspective of their relationship, and the power imbalance there is quite striking. I give this one 2 stars. I think, again, if you liked the movie, you probably will like the book, but for me, being inside Therese's head was just a little bit too much. Next, I want to talk about this book, which is called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This is a coming-of-age novel that's set in the 1960s about a young woman who is raised by a Pentecostal evangelist mother and is coming to terms not only with being the daughter of a Christian and whether or not she agrees with her mother's religion, but also a novel about coming to terms with her own lesbianism. The thing about this novel that I think is so interesting is that I was totally not expecting a child narrator to have the maturity that this novel really espouses. The thing is that the best child narrators, in my opinion, are ones who use the inherently naive lens of childhood to highlight some of the inconsistencies and oddities in the behavior of the adults in their lives. This is definitely a novel that does that. And so even when the main character doesn't directly question her mother's beliefs, we get such an interesting perspective on what it means to be an evangelical Christian in the United Kingdom during this time. This is a novel that it has beautiful, slightly purple, but quite short, so purple in the right way kind of prose, but also has just a great sense of humor, and I ended up giving this one 5 stars. Next, I'm going to talk about some other historical fiction novels, the first of those being this one, The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara. This is a novel about the Harlem drag scene, specifically the House of Extravaganza, which was the first all-Latinx house, and the subject of the documentary Paris is Burning. I read this novel in a couple of days, and then I put it down and didn't review it for 20 days, because I really did not know how to articulate why I did not like it. The thing is that this novel follows the lives of real people, and I don't want to discount the lives of those people or the pain that they suffered. So let's get that out of the way. I do know that it was really hard to be a poor Latinx, gay, or trans person in Harlem during this time. I do know that. The thing is that from all of the oral histories that I've been reading, especially recently, about the early drag scenes and about gay and trans life during this period, it seems to me, and it seems in these writings, that the drag scene was, especially the drag balls, specifically those events, were one of the great highlights of existences that were otherwise extremely awful, that were otherwise full of pain, misery, poverty, violence, the AIDS epidemic. But when these people went to the ball scenes, that was a time when they could experience fun, glamour, and joy. The thing is that this novel has taken the narrative approach of not discussing the drag ball scenes at all. There is one in this entire novel, and it is one in which this character who participates in the scene does so behind the back of the House of Extravaganza, does not tell them what he is doing, does not ask for their support, even if they would readily give it. That kind of adds up to a feeling that we have stripped all of the joy and happiness out of these real characters' lives and just put it on page in a way that reads like torture porn. Again, this is a category that I feel like I'm fixating on because I think it is so important to tell stories that are sad but sympathetic, but also have points of levity and joy in them, and it really does make me question the purpose of removing all of the joy from this story. The thing is that the writing of this book is otherwise pretty unremarkable, so I'm really just fixating on the fact that there is no gay or trans tenderness, love, and support, and community, and joy in this book. Everything is just bittersweet, and it really does make me question the legacy that this book is going to leave in the minds of people who don't know any better about this particular scene. I give this one 3 stars. I also listened to this book, Beowulf for Cretins by McMan. I wanted to read another LGBT-themed contemporary, maybe even a romance, after I had a kind of mixed but not wholly bad experience with another lesbian romance novel this year. And so I thought that maybe I could break my undying hatred of romance novels. The thing is that I didn't in this case. This novel had a lot of my pet peeves for romance, which include such difficulties as characters who don't talk to each other and can't work out their problems like normal humans, miscommunication plot lines, extremely convenient plots that are excused by phrases like, "This only happens in novels," and some truly cringeworthy statements of affection in this book. I thought that because it focuses on 2 lesbians who work at a university, one professor and one who is becoming an academic head of staff, the president of the college, I think, I thought that that would mean that this book was smart and interesting and maybe a little bit clever, and it would focus on like what it would actually mean in that situation. But it was just like a fluffy romance novel. I gave this one 2 stars. Wasn't really worth it. I also want to mention briefly Leth by Sean Greer. This was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. I have found myself feeling a little bit more kindly to this novel the longer that I think about it. At first, I really wasn't quite sure how I felt about it and didn't really care for it, but now it's slowly growing on me. Sean Greer has written a novel about a young man named Arthur Less, who is not so young anymore. He's coming to terms with being a middle-aged gay man, with a lover that he has left and a writing career that is stalling. He is the kind of archetypal schmuck character. In a lot of ways, we spend the majority of the first half of the book talking about just how badly he sucks at absolutely everything he does. This is not my favorite kind of thing to read, and while I do think that the second half of the book brings all of that into perspective in an interesting way, it's still something that I struggle with and something that I would prefer not to read anymore. So apparently adding writers and schmucks to my list of protagonists I don't want to read for is most of what I got out of this book. That being said, if you don't share my particular prejudices towards protagonists, say that 5 times fast, then I will say that this has some remarkable writing in it, and I do think that it has a lot of really great literary merit, and I ended up giving this one 3 stars, but in retrospect it might even be a 4. It's something that I'm still developing my feelings on. I'm going to move into graphic novels next. The first of those that I'm going to talk about is Moonstruck, Volume 1, which is by Grace Ellis and Shae Beagle. This is a graphic novel which is about a world very similar to our own. It feels very contemporary, except that there are werewolves, ghosts, all sorts of different magical creatures who live alongside humans, and including in very banal situations like working in a little coffee shop. This graphic novel is pretty notable because of how diverse its representation is, both in terms of race and culture, and gender and sexuality. It stars a female-female romance between werewolves, but the thing is that I just found this one a little bit too cutesy for me. I was hoping that the magical creatures, the presence of things like werewolves and vampires, would give this comic a little bit of grit to it, but it was hard to feel invested in any of the characters and in any of their safety when it never felt like they were in much danger. It really did just feel a little bit too fluffy for me. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. The next graphic novel that I'm going to talk about is actually kind of a bind-up of some comics, and that is The Essential Dykes to Watch Out For by Alison Bechdel. Now, this is a lesbian-centric comic strip that Alison Bechdel published over the course of 25 years in various online publications and on her own. And in this, it follows a bunch of characters who are not so much doing coming-of-age lesbian stories. Almost all of them, I think, have come out before the events of the comic take place, but it's more like a coming of maturity for the lesbian movement. Since it has been written from the late 80s into the early 2000s, you really do get a sense of what these characters are going through as their attraction changes, and how their relationships with other lesbians change, and how the movement has changed from something that was essentially countercultural to something that was quite mainstream. I absolutely love the characters in this kind of comic book series because they are flawed in extremely realistic ways, and they also go into relationships and talk to each other in ways that I think are wonderfully realistic. They struggle with things like ableism and racism and the politics of the new emerging right in America, but even if the characters are not perfect and they are allowed to be flawed, they are usually corrected for things like misgendering other people, or for assuming that being a lesbian is the end-all of oppression and lets them talk down to other people. I think that this comic is genuinely extremely funny, and it's just kind of my sense of humor. There are definitely places in it where I saw myself and I saw my other friends, and I'm absolutely charmed by this one. I want to pick up another Alison Bechdel. I think her comic memoir, Fun Home, is going to be something that I read in the very near future. I gave this bind-up 5 stars. Lastly, in the LGBT fiction category, I want to briefly mention some of the books that have their own videos. So I have another video on my channel which is about the works that I read that were international reads for this month. If you didn't already know, I am doing a project to read a book from every country, and I'm updating every 5 books or so. So I've talked about all of these books more at length in that video, which I will leave in the description box down below. However, just to briefly mention them here, I have read this month The Ministry of Utmost Happiness by Arundhati Roy, which I gave 3 stars. Infidels by Abdallah Taya, which I gave 5 stars. Notes of a Crocodile by Q Majin, which I gave 5 stars. Tentacle by Rita Indiana, which I gave 2 stars. And La Bastarda by Trifonia Meliba Abono, which I gave 2 stars. The next section I'm going to talk about is poetry, and I'm going to start that off with The Mermaid's Voice Returns in this one by Amanda Lovelace. Now, this poetry collection is by an author whose previous poetry collection in the same trilogy of poems, which is called The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one, won the 2018 Goodreads Choice Award winners for poetry. I couldn't get my hands on the Witch collection, so I wanted to get my hands on this one, because Amanda Lovelace self-identifies as queer. And so I picked this one up and had pretty high hopes for it, because Amanda Lovelace is a poet that is pretty highly regarded on the bookish internet, very beloved. Unfortunately, this is one of those collections that just has one of my major pet peeves for poetry, especially contemporary poetry, which is that it's just basically sentences that are broken up and scattered across the page without regard to rhythm of speech or lyricism in any regard. The themes of this poetry collection are quite important. This one in particular is about healing, especially healing after sexual assault or sexual misconduct by your partner. And that makes me reticent to dislike it as much as I do, because I know that the subjects are important, but I felt that the quality of the poems was extremely subpar. Now I guess I know that Amanda Lovelace's poetry is not for me. I gave this one 1 star. The other collection that I read this month was Devotions by Mary Oliver. This is a collection of Mary Oliver's poetry that have been published in other collections of hers, but in getting an introduction to Mary Oliver, I did want something that spanned quite a few years of her career. A lot of her poetry, to me, feels very standard poetry-ish, if that makes any sense. There's a lot of the themes in it that I feel like I've been reading since I was quite young, including questions about what is the nature of prayer? Can animals pray? What is the nature of human versus the natural world? And all this kind of, these questions that I feel like I have heard other poets ask before. There are some really wonderful poems in this collection. There's one that's called Violets, which to me is one of my favorites now. And it's a poetry collection that I would recommend for somebody who's just getting started in Mary Oliver's poetry, because I do think that it's good to get that kind of introduction. So, while a lot of the poems in here were not my taste, there were enough of them that I ended up giving this collection 3 stars. Next, I want to move on to the LGBT-centric nonfiction that I read this month, starting with this book, Rainbow Warrior: My Life in Color by Gilbert Baker. For those of you who don't know, Gilbert Baker was the person who designed the first rainbow flag in 1978. This flag, of course, became a huge symbol for gay liberation and for the broader LGBT movement. And it's so interesting that because of how recent the history is, we know who designed it, and now you can read his memoir. What I think is most valuable about this story, besides Baker's wonderful sense of humor, is that this is a book which shows you all of the behind-the-scenes effort that goes into any kind of protest or LGBT pride event. For those of us who only, take pleasure in participating in these events, but do not organize them ourselves, it is so important to recognize the amount of time, effort, and money that goes into designing all of these events, and I think Gilbert Baker's book is a great way to go about kind of getting involved and understanding that perspective all the more. I gave this book 4 stars. I also read Where Am I Now by Mara Wilson, who you might know as the actress who played Matilda in the mid-90s movie. Now, Matilda was kind of an interesting movie to me. I watched it as a slightly older child, and so it doesn't have the same place in my heart that I feel like it does for other people, but it's a pretty good movie. And Mara Wilson writes essays in this book about her experiences filming the movie, filming other movies that she was in, like Mrs. Doubtfire, about celebrities that she met, but also about her experiences of growing up, and especially growing up as a child actor. My favorite essay in here was her experiences with having childhood and then later OCD, which is a experience that I really resonated with. And so there were parts of this book that I found really interesting. Unfortunately, I do not find reading about early preteens and their baby sexual experiences or making out with each other very interesting. I also really kind of struggle with celebrity memoirs, I guess, now I'm learning, because it's hard to take people's problems seriously when they live a life of such absolute privilege, that sort of thing. The thing is that Mara Wilson's sense of humor also didn't really captivate me, so I leave my review feeling kind of meh about the thing as a whole. I picked this one up specifically for Pride Month because Mara Wilson is bisexual. In this book, she refers to herself one time as straight and never mentions being bisexual, but her Twitter seems the most up-to-date version of her sexuality, and so, according to that one, she's bisexual. So, it was not for me, this book, I will say, and I think I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Next, I want to talk about this book, Female Masculinity by Jack Halberstam. This is a book which I actually just finished reading at about 3 o'clock this morning. I kind of stayed up all night to just get it done before the month ended. And this one is difficult. It is a queer theory book, and like most queer theory books, it's very dense, it has a very strange vocabulary, And it really does come across like Jack Halberstam has never spoken to another human before in his life. I struggle with it sometimes because I do think that there's some really important messages in this book about what it means to separate masculinity from just being male, how both men and women strive for masculinity, so it might not necessarily just be a male trait. But there's a lot of really interesting history in here, and I'm glad that I read this in the same month that I read 2 books about Anne Lister, also Alison Bechdel's The Essential Dykes to Watch Out For, and Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, because all of those are discussed in this book. I was going to give this back to the library today, but as you can see, I have quite a few notes in here. I'm still formulating my thoughts on it as a whole. Generally speaking, I have pretty mixed feelings about this. There's arguments in here that I think are extremely coherent and extremely interesting, and other arguments that, for me, just fall flat. One notable one being a case in which Jack Halberstam argues that male bathrooms are places not just of homosocial interaction, but homoerotic interaction. Informal poll of a bunch of men in my life says that that is not the case, including one who said, how could it be sexy? It stinks in there. It's one of those things where theorists sometimes get so involved in the theory of what they're thinking and just forget what happens in real life. I don't know if I would recommend this to everybody. I think if you have already a background in reading queer theory, sociology, gender studies, anthropology, then you might have a little bit more success with this than perhaps what I would call an average reader would. I still want to write up some more specific thoughts, so if you want to hear my thoughts more fully, add me on Goodreads down below and you'll see when I type up my full thoughts. Before I move on from the LGBT-centric nonfiction, I also just want to briefly mention 2 other books that have another video on my channel already if you want to see my fuller thoughts. They are Gentleman Jack, The Real Anne Lister by Anne Choma, and Gentleman Jack, Regency Landowner, Seducer, and Secret Diarist by Angela Stidel. I did a video comparing which of these books that I think you should read, and so I will also link that one down in the comments below if you want to see my fuller thoughts. In the next section, I'm going to be talking about the reads that I did this month that were not specifically LGBT themed. I'm going to start off that section by talking about this book, The Role of the Scroll, an illustrated introduction to scrolls in the Middle Ages by Thomas Forrest Kelly. This is a tiny little book which talks all about the fact that books, what you might think of as like this, with a front cover and pages and a back cover and it's like that, this is called a codex, and it was introduced at the end of the Roman Empire, roughly in the 5th century, and coincided with the rise of Christianity. However, despite the fact that this was now the dominant way of preserving information, there were still instances in which a person would instead use a scroll. And so this is kind of an interrogation as to why some of the less technologically advanced scrolls were being used during a period when a better technology was available. I will say that this is a really well-researched and very interesting book about art history, and it has some really interesting alchemical and beautiful scrolls in here, and it's just most pleasing to my inner 12-year-old that there is such a thing as an alchemical medieval scroll. Just one of those things, you know. I ended up giving this one, I think, 5 stars or something like that. I really enjoyed it, and it is something that I'm just going to buy my own copy of so I can have it as a reference point. This month I also received an arc of The Art of Love by Kate Bryan. This is a short little book which has many essays and some beautiful illustrations about different artists in history who were couples, so couples both of whom were artists. And in this way, I think this is quite an interesting little book, definitely an interesting little premise, but I ended up feeling that it was a little bit unfocused. For the most part, Kate Bryan has said in the introduction to this book that she was trying to deconstruct the notion of specifically a female artist who subsumed her career to support a male artist. That's a very common narrative that is spun in art history, and she wanted to show other narratives. But the thing is that she very rarely did so, and there's a lot of places when I think her writing is unintentionally a little bit misogynistic, especially in the ways that she described women's appearances and not men's appearances. Anyway, I wrote a longer review about this one on Goodreads, but I'm not going to dwell on it. I gave it 2 stars. I want to briefly mention The Castle on Sunset by Sean Levy. This is a book which is about the Chateau Marmont, which is a hotel in Hollywood. And, of course, being a hotel in Hollywood, it's also about the lives of the various people who called it home at one point or another. I'm tepidly interested in hotels, in the history of hotels. I have a couple of other books on my TBR that are hotel-related, because I think that they're such interesting, almost liminal spaces between the public and the domestic anyway. I think they're just very interesting. Unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of Hollywood history that I read, I don't have the frame of reference to understand who a lot of these celebrities are, and I'm not interested in celebrities as a whole, and so this ended up being just kind of a middle range read for me. I will say it was interesting to read it in the same month that I read The City and the Pillar by Gore Vidal, because Gore Vidal stayed at this particular hotel and set an entire novel there, so that was a really great piece of crossover, but overall I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I want to briefly next mention Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. This is a personal essay collection which I picked up specifically because I had seen Roxane Gay listed on a kind of like short list on someone's website of LGBT authors that are worth reading. The thing is that, as far as I am aware now, Roxane Gay does not anymore identify as any kind of LGBT or queer, and so definitely in this essay collection, she specifically mentions that she used to identify as queer but no longer does. And so, I guess it's just not one of those reads for me this month. I don't know. The thing is that this essay collection was not what I personally thought it would be at first. It's not all about just bad feminism or what it means to be a feminist. It's a very interesting essay collection. My favorite was the essay about Scrabble. I thought that was particularly fascinating. And I do think that Roxane Gay's humor, but also sensitivity, are really valuable. I would like to read another collection of Roxane Gay's work, and I gave this one 4 stars. Lastly, I just want to briefly mention 2 books that I have made individual book reviews for, the first of those being Why Your 5-Year-Old Could Not Have Done That, Modern Art Explained by Susie Hodge, and the second being Aloha, Rodeo, 3 Hawaiian Cowboys, The World's Greatest Rodeo, and The Hidden History of the American West by David Woolman and Julian Smith. I made individual book reviews for them. They're part of my nonfiction micro-review series, so if you're interested in reading more of my thoughts, I will leave links to those videos down below. The next book that I'm going to talk about is the sequel to this one. I read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel in January of this year, and when the 3rd book in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy was announced for coming out in March of 2020, I knew I had to pick up the sequel so that I could read the first book, the second book, and then be ready for the 3rd book. So this trilogy follows Thomas Cromwell, who was a non-noble man who nevertheless worked his way up into the court of Henry VIII and into the cabinet of Henry VIII. The first book, Wolf Hall, actually focuses on Thomas Cromwell's rise and his ability to encourage the divorce of Henry VIII and Catherine. Bring Up the Bodies follows the fall of Anne Boleyn, and so it is a much different novel in tone, the ending of it in particular, but I think it's a great example of a sequel that is as good as the original. There is tremendous writing in here, and I think it's so interesting that Thomas Cromwell comes across as someone who is deeply flawed, but still deeply sympathetic, and a character that I cannot wait to read the final installment, and I gave this one 5 stars. Alright, so those were the 29 books that I read in June of 2019. Please do let me know if you have read any of these books in the comments down below, or what you read this month, and please give me some recommendations for any books that you think I might be interested in. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!